unity, one God, one life, one way, one reality.
Now that becomes a different issue, but what we wanted to point out was, especially in the fact of murder, which is a prohibition against taking life, what would be the opposite of that is preserving life. And whether it be a human life or plant life or animal life, whatever kind of life it is, yes, it might be a lower form of life, but we have an obligation to preserve it, whatever it is. Then we could go to the prohibition against theft. And I think this is one that you can really point things out, right? The prohibition against theft. If we don't steal, now that's a good thing, and that's a certain level of perfection. But there's a greater perfection that can come out of that prohibition, and that's doing the opposite of it. Now, by the way, all I'm saying is we're not commanded. Don't get me wrong. We're not commanded. But just to look at the 7, there's a realization that there's another side to it, just as Michael points out in his book. There are other virtues. So even though I'm not commanded to give charity, right? But there is this problem back in the book of Genesis with Sodom and Gomorrah. Even though, you know, they're living under the Noahide Laws system at that time, and by the way, ignorance is, you know, you can't claim ignorance on this. Now, what we do find out is that here is a group of people that God finally extinguishes from the face of the earth. And a lot of people will say, oh, it's because they were into all kinds of sexual sins, you know, there were places full of homosexuals. No, that's a sin, don't get me wrong. And there probably were some of those types of people that lived in that area. I'm not saying they're not. But when we really get down to it and we find out who is really, what is the sin that these people did that deserved the death penalty? In other words, what was this sin that they did that was so great that God decided that these people no longer were allowed to live on the face of the earth, right? That they had gone against everything. And what we find in the book of Ezekiel, one of the great prophets of God, right? He identifies exactly what was going on with this group of people at that time. And Ezekiel says, here was a people that were sated with bread. Now, what means sated? They had plenty of bread. They had plenty of everything. But the one thing they didn't have plenty of, and that was charity. They were not a charitable people. And because they were not a charitable people, that is why God ultimately destroys these people. Now, is there a commandment for them to be charitable? Well, among the 7, we don't find one.
Not directly spelled out.
Not directly spelled out. And let me point out also, too, this wasn't necessarily a violation of a law, but it was a violation of a moral issue. Right? A moral issue. Because when Hashem came down and saw what was going on in this place, they were doing evil in the sight of Hashem. It was a moral issue. And the moral issue was they were not a charitable people. So if we want to be a virtuous people, right? It's not just that we don't steal, but we actually turn around and become givers. That we are a charitable people. We never want to follow prey like the people of Sodom and Gomorrah in those cities that actually lived by the rule of law. But it was their laws that they had made that actually allowed them to steal from people and not be charitable. It was just the opposite of that. And so they lived in this really wealthy place. It was, as the Bible tells us, it was a well-watered plain. In other words, it was a place where you could have a lot of flocks. You could probably grow a lot of crops, you know, a really beautiful, lush place, and had pretty much anything they wanted, but they were not going to share that with anyone. And so they basically made laws that prevented strangers from staying there. When strangers did come in, they actually had laws that would allow them to steal a certain amount without being brought before the court system. So everybody in the town would steal just that certain amount. They would make sure that they only stole that little bit of amount. And therefore they couldn't be put under any kind of justice system. Why? Because they were within the law. But again, all these laws prevented the really main factor was that they were not kind, they were not compassionate, they were not charitable.
They were self-gratifying laws when they implemented.
Very selfish. We would say they probably fit what we call today, and you hear this term, many terms today in our society as being narcissistic. They were a narcissistic society. They were a society that loved themselves, only cared for themselves, and of course eventually brings the wrath of God down upon themselves because of that. So even though these people didn't have a commandment to do chesed, to do compassion and kindness and charity, we do find that they're judged for a lack of it. Right? So that's kind of interesting. So if we take that prohibition against theft, right, then we have to say, okay, what is the opposite of theft? What can really impact my life? What can make me a better individual? What perfection can I gain? You know, okay, I got a little perfection here because I'm not stealing from someone, but the real perfection is the other side. The real perfection for the individual is that now he becomes a charitable person. Not to the point that he just gives, but he actually loves to give. There's a great book, by the way. It's a little small book. It's called Ahava Hesed, and it's written by the Kopetz Chaim. It's based on the passage in the book of Micah, chapter 6, where God says, "Oh man, I have told you." You know, in other words, I've already gave you instruction what you should do, what is good, what is righteous, right? He says to keep God's justice, to keep, you know, the judgments of God, to keep His justice. Yes, that's part of it. But then he says something interesting. He says, but you should also love chesed. You should love compassion and kindness and tzedakah. Those are traits that you should really love. So, you know, if we're not going to steal, and that's a good trait, by the way, but not just stealing is not going to fulfill the vacant virtue that we are expected as a human being, as becoming a real Adam, a real perfected human being. So as Michael says in his book, and I'm glad you have a place here, I want to read this again. He says, there's more, and he's talking about the 7 laws. As you go deeper into this study, you will encounter the following remarkable principle. No one is virtuous unless he goes so far as to do the very opposite of whatever the Noahide Laws forbid. He says a man, excuse me, cannot fully satisfy the Noahide Law against larceny, for instance, unless he gives charity. The Noahide Law against profaning God's name unless he acts to sanctify the name. The Noahide Law against murder unless he acts to save the life of the person in danger, etc., etc. So, again, it's back to the fact that these ideas of virtues, this idea of working toward perfection, is not just in the fact that I don't do anything, right? Okay, I'll give you an example. And you can answer this one, okay? So, I happen to swing by your house one day and I see you running around your house. And there's a guy chasing you, right? And I see him with a gun or an instrument of death in his hand. And this guy's really angry. And I can hear him yelling, when I catch you, I'm going to shoot you. I'm going to cut you up in little pieces. I'm going to make sure that every bit of life is drained out of you. And I say to myself, well, you know, I wish Hiram good luck. It's not me that's going to murder him, right? I'm just going to drive him down the road. And I hope Hiram can defend himself and somehow get this gun or this axe or whatever this guy has away from him. I hope he can really defend himself. And I just get in my car and casually drive him down the road. Now, have I violated the prohibition against murder? No. I'm not the guy that's doing the murdering.